Baffled for the fourth time, the consuls tried another tactic, building a mole in an area of shallow waters. One night, a Carthaginian ship exiting Lilybaeum got stuck on the mole, and the Romans promptly seized it and manned it with their fastest rowers. When Hannibal, the Rhodian, returned for another mission, the Romans let him slip in, but their commandeered vessel immediately gave chase as he sailed out. This ship caught up with the Rhodian, and the nobleman prepared to give battle. But the Roman marines boarded his vessels in overwhelming numbers, finally capturing the daring blockade runner. His magnificent ship was also seized and used to chase off or capture other runners during the blockade. Meanwhile, inside the city, whilst Hamilcar had focused exclusively on strengthening his defenses until the forces of nature came to his aid. Sure enough, a violent windstorm soon erupted, wrecking the wooden towers used by the Romans to protect their siege engines and siege works. A unit of Greek mercenaries sensed an opportunity. Splitting into 3 groups, they hurled lit fire upon the Roman works. Flames erupted almost immediately, and soon spread due to the strong winds. Scorched by fire and blinded by the smoke, the legionnaires failed to put out the blaze. The destruction was almost complete, as a single day of bad weather and Greek fire, pun intended, had destroyed weeks of Roman hard work. The consuls gave up on the idea of breaching Lilybaeum's walls and switched tactics. They surrounded the city with a deep ditch and wooden stockade, erected a wall to protect their own camp, and left the completion of the siege to Saturn, the god of time. When the year turned to 249 BC, the besiegers received 10,000 troops as a reinforcement, marching behind the new consul Publius Claudius Puc. As soon as he arrived, Claudius announced a surprising change of plans. The bulk of the troops would sail off to attack the city of Drepanum instead. Claudius' fleet, 123 ships strong, departed at midnight and reached their target by the following morning, surprising the commander of the local garrison, General Ade. However, the beleaguered general gathered his wits very quickly and ordered his men to sail out and meet the Romans at sea before they could establish a blockade. When the Carthaginians sailed out, the Roman fleet was split into 3 squadrons, one inside Drepanum's harbor, one at its entrance, and one still outside. Claudius realized they were too far apart to mount an effective defense, and ordered the forward-facing vessels to hastily row out of the harbor. This was a disastrous decision, as the advanced Roman squadron collided with the other 2. Many of their oars were broken, compromising their speed and mobility. In the meanwhile, Hannibal's fleet rowed out of the harbor and performed a swift outflanking maneuver, thus pressing the Romans dangerously close to the coastline. Hannibal signaled his ships to form a long line, parallel to the coast, and then he gave order to charge. The Carthaginian ships rammed hard into the Roman prows and broadsides, sinking a great number. Others were captured by the experienced marine soldiers manning the Punic vessels. When Claudius realized that his forces were nearing catastrophe, he managed to extricate only 30 ships, while the others were sunk or seized by Hannibal's sailors. The defeat at Drepanum did not shatter Roman resolve. On the contrary, the Senate organized a new fleet of 60 warships and 800 transports, carrying supplies to the besiegers at Lilybaeum. The fleet made a stop in Messina, where it was reinforced by 60 more naval vessels, then made a second stop in Syracuse and resumed its route towards Lilybaeum, sailing along Sicily's southern coast. Meanwhile, Hannibal, the victor of Drepanum, had dispatched his deputy, Carthalo, and a fleet 100 ships strong in aid of Himiko, commander at Lilybaeum. Carthalo fell upon the Romans anchored at Lilybaeum, setting several ships on fire and capturing others. At the same time, Himiko ordered a sortie, causing further disarray amongst the Roman lines. The fight ended quickly, as Carthalo towed away his captured vessels and laid anchor south of Lilybaeum. Then, by chance, his sailors sighted another Roman fleet approaching from the east, the relief convoy from Syracuse. But the Romans had taken precautions to send light boats ahead of them as scouts. The scouts sensed the ambush and reported back to their officers, who prepared a counter-ambush. The Roman fleet dropped anchor by the coast, and the soldiers on board disembarked and trained their catapults and ballistae toward the sea. When Carthalo arrived in range, his ships were targeted by a shower of projectiles. The admiral was unable to fight back but could seize some of the enemy's transport ships and sail eastwards towards the Cape of Pach. Unbeknownst to him, 2 Roman squadrons, just sailing off Syracuse, were heading his way. Luckily for Carthalo, the Romans preferred to avoid combat, for they were wary of closing into a treacherously rocky stretch of the shore. The experienced Carthaginian sailors realized immediately that a storm was brewing and persuaded their commander to ignore the enemy ships altogether. It was the right decision. As Carthalo headed towards Pachinus, nature did the job for him. A catastrophic storm hit the coastline, wrecking all the Roman ships. This was the 3rd maritime disaster endured by the Romans during the war, which, once again, shattered their resolve to attempt operations by sea. However, in the year 248 BC, Consul Lucius Junius was determined to continue fighting on land. He led his forces on foot across Sicily, from Syracuse to Lilybaeum, to tighten the noose on the Carthaginian stronghold. In need of an easy victory, Junius set his sight on the minor Punic center of Eryx, guarding the road between Punic and Drepana. The town could be reached only through a narrow and steep mountain road, but the consul was not deterred. In a swift action, his legions made the ascent and took Eryx by storm, conquering a landmark of high symbolic value, the Temple of Asinian Aphrodite. This minor victory marked the end of the 16th year of the First Punic War, a conflict that severely tested the capabilities of both parties. Rome and Carthage were exhausted, to the brink of collapse, having suffered hundreds of thousands of losses, but neither of them was willing to give in. A new phase of the war was about to begin, one that would see the rise of the first notable member of a bloodline of relentless enemies of Rome. Hamilcar Barca, following Hamilcar's fleet, targeted the Italian mainland, as he first raided the district of Locri and then devastated other locations along the Calabrian coast. He then changed the theater of operations again, sailing to Sicily's northwestern coast and seizing Hercid. This town was perched atop a mountain just outside Panermus, in direct view of the Roman garrison. But the mountain was protected by 3 almost vertical cliffsides, which made it virtually impregnable. From Hercid, Hamilcar dominated the roads connecting the Roman strongholds of Panormus and Eryx. Moreover, he had access to a harbor from which he could reach Lille and Drepana. Finally, he could use the port to launch raids on the Italian coasts, reaching as far north as Cumae and Campania. The Republic, after having suffered a string of naval defeats and maritime disasters in the past years, was not able to oppose him effectively at sea. And on land, all the Panermus garrison was able to do was establish a detached camp a kilometer from Hercid. General Barca, however, did not fall into the trap of an open battle. Instead, his forces slipped past the Roman camp and then harassed the legions around Panormus and beyond, ambushing foraging parties or engaging in rapid skirmishes before returning to base. The Greek historian Polybius described the following years of fighting as a boxing match between two contenders of equal strength, skill, and courage, who exchanged their punches, feints, blocks, and quick retreats on a daily basis. After slugging it out for 3 years, Hamilcar decided to attempt a more decisive action. His troops moved out of Hercid and occupied a town close to the Roman hilltop fortress of Eryx. From there, they were able to isolate the legions on its summit and put them under siege for a further 2 years. The struggle resumed as obstinately and fiercely as ever, likened by Polybius to a cockfight in which none of the exhausted roosters was willing to give up. Both Rome and Carthage were, in fact, almost completely worn out by more than 20 years of constant war. In the last years, expensive naval warfare had almost dwindled to nothing, while operations on land dragged on as Hamilcar's inferior force kept in check the legions in Sicily. The Romans, however, were willing to make one last titanic leap forward to unlock the stalemate. The Republic's coffers were empty, but several wealthy citizens were happy to contribute to the war effort by privately funding the construction of a new fleet. The fundraising campaign was so successful that Rome was able to launch 200 state-of-the-art quinquerini. In 242 BC, the new fleet was put under the command of Consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, who proceeded to blockade the ports of Lilybaeum and Drepanum. With both cities firmly under siege, he drilled his sailors, oarsmen, and marines, all of whom had been picked from among his best legions. Lutatius knew that the only way to put an end to the long war was to inflict a final, decisive naval defeat on Carthage. He had laid the bait, and the catch would soon arrive. By 242 BC, the Carthaginians had greatly scaled back their fleet and appeared unable to pick up the consul's gauntlet. But news of the reborn Roman squadrons greatly impressed Carthage. After having left Hamilcar to his own devices for 4 years, the Carthaginian Senate finally decided to resume ship and resupply their brilliant general. By 241 BC, a fleet left Carthage, loaded with provisions. Command of this newly minted navy was trusted to General Hanno, who formulated a simple plan: evade the Roman fleet, drop anchor near Eryx, and resupply Hamilcar's troops. Once his ships were lighter, he planned to take aboard Hamilcar, his best soldiers. Only then did he aim to attack the Roman navy. In preparation for this action, Hanno dropped anchor at the Holy Isle off the coast of Lilybaeum. Unbeknownst to Hanno, Gaius Lutatius was informed of the Carthaginian admiral's arrival and seized the initiative. From his anchorage at Lilybaeum, he boarded his best legionnaires and sailed his squadrons to the island of Agusa, from where he could block Hanno's path. The following morning, the 10th of March, 241 BC, the Carthaginian fleet appeared on the horizon, enjoying a strong breeze from the west. Soon the wind grew into a storm and the sea turned rough. Lutatius was wary of subjecting his fleet to yet another maritime disaster, but he could not let Hanno slip through. At Lutatius' signal, the Roman oarsmen rowed in unison against the crashing waves. Deploying their quinqueremes into a single line, their prows directed squarely at Hanno. Seeing this, the Carthaginians lowered their masts, and their oarsmen, too, rowed on full power towards the Romans, bracing themselves for contact. Despite their gallant effort, the Carthaginians were, on this occasion, no match for the Romans. Lutatius' ships were faster, more maneuverable, and better manned. The rostra of the Republic plowed into the sides of the Punic Wars, shattering their oars and piercing their hulls. Many more of Hanno's ships were surrounded and stormed by the Roman marines. In the span of one morning, Hanno lost 50 ships, sunk, and 70 captured with their crews. Only a sudden wind from the east allowed the survivors to escape back to Holy Isle. Once again, Rome ruled the waves, and Carthage was unable to support the gallant Hamilcar Barca, still stranded on Sicily. All the Carthaginians could do was send a message to the general, giving him the freedom to decide whether to continue the fight or not. Wisely, Barca realized he could not resist much longer and sent envoys to Lutatius, seeking terms for peace. And the consul was happy to negotiate, as he knew that Rome's resources were nearing collapse. Thus, the longest war known to humanity until that time, at least according to Polybius, had come to an end after an estimated 1 million lives had been lost to fighting, drowning, disease, and starvation. The first draft of the peace treaty demanded that the Carthaginians evacuate Sicily and return all Roman prisoners without ransom. They had to pledge not to declare war on Syracuse nor its allies, and they committed to pay 2,200 talents of silver to Rome over 20 years, roughly equivalent to 70 metric tons of the precious metal. The settlement agreed by Lutatius and Hamilcar was revised by the Roman Centuriate Assembly, who made the conditions even harsher. Now Carthage had to pay 3,200 talents over just 10 years. The woes for Carthage, however, were far from over, as another conflict, a direct consequence of the First Punic War, loomed over the horizon. After signing the peace treaty, Hamilcar gave orders to all Carthaginian troops, most of whom were mercenaries, to return to North Africa. In 240 BC, Barca's subordinate, General Gesco, organized the transport piecemeal, shipping mercenaries to Carthage in small detachments. His instructions were for the Senate back home to pay each unit on their arrival and then dismiss them, so as to avoid a large concentration of mercenary troops within the city walls. But the Senate ignored Gesco's advice. Knowing concentration of mercenary troops within the city walls. But the Senate ignored Gesco's advice. Knowing that they could afford only a reduced pay to the hired swords, they thought that by entertaining them in Carthage for some days, they could soften the pill. This was a terrible idea, of course, and the mercenaries launched into a destructive bender. The government convinced the mercenary officers to relocate their troops to the nearby city of Sitka, where the lawless spree continued, exacerbated by the delayed pay of wages. After fruitless negotiations with General Hannibal, the mercenaries elected leaders, the Libyan Mathos and the Campanian Spendius, and decided to take the matter of payment into their own hands. 20,000 men strong, the rebel army then marched to Tunis and pitched their camp, directly threatening Carthage from the south. Mathos then sent emissaries to various cities in Libya, urging them to join in the rebellion against Carthage. The appeal was successful, and an additional 70,000 men joined the rebel army in Tunis. From there, Mathos dispatched a forces, laying siege to Utica and Hippos Aretus, thus completely isolating the city of Carthage proper. The city rulers prepared to resist and appointed General Hanno as commander-in-chief. He proceeded to hire new, more loyal mercenaries, as well forming and drilling a citizen militia, which he then led against the rebel encampment outside Utica. His assault was initially successful, as his elephant charge laid waste among the besiegers, dispersing them onto a nearby hill. Emboldened by the success, Hanno and his men grew complacent, relaxing discipline and looting the enemy camp. Meanwhile, the rebels reorganized their ranks and fell upon Hanno's forces, killing a large part and forcing the rest to retreat. According to Polybius, Hanno again proved his incompetence some days later, when he encountered the enemy again in a nearby encampment but failed to surround and destroy their contingent. The Carthaginian Senate, therefore, relieved Hanno of his command and appointed a more trustworthy general, Hamilcar Barca himself. Hamilcar assembled a new army, numbering 70 elephants and 10,000 mercenaries, militias, and deserters from the rebel camp. Barca had a tough challenge ahead. To move out of Carthage and relieve the siege of Utica, he had to pass the Bagradas River, which could be crossed only through one bridge, which was guarded by 10,000 of Mathos' men. But the crafty general had observed that, in certain weather conditions, a portion of the river tended to silt, thus offering a chance to cross it on foot. When the right moment arrived, Barca's army marched through the Bagradas at night, and the following morning, attacked Mathos' forces from the rear. When the rebel co-leader Spendius realized what was happening, he left the camp outside Utica with 15,000 soldiers. Marching to the rescue of Mathos' Hamilcar, initially marched in parallel to the combined force of 25,000 rebels, with his elephants at the front, followed by the cavalry, the light infantry, and finally, the lines of heavy hoplites. Suddenly, his army halted and spun to the right, retreating from the enemy. Sensing victory, Spendius and Mathos launched an all-out charge on Hamilcar, but it was a trap. The general ordered his hoplites to form a line and face the enemy again. The rebel charge crashed against the wall of shields and spears, suffering heavy casualties. Then, the elephants and cavalry also turned around, smashing onto the survivors. 6,000 rebel troops were killed, while 2,000 were taken prisoner in the action. Hamilcar pressed his advantage, taking the encampment on the Bagradas by storm and forcing the few survivors to flee to Tunis. The siege of Utica had been relieved, and Hamilcar's next objective was to liberate the blockade of Hippos. However, Mathos and Spendius managed to reorganize their forces, securing support from Numidian allies and 2,000 Gaulish mercenaries under a man named Autoratus. Thus, while marching towards Hippos Zarytus, Hamilcar found himself surrounded by Libyan mercenaries on his front, the Numidians on the rear, and Spinaeus and Ateratus on his flank. This could have been the end of Hamilcar Barca had he not received the unexpected help of a Numidian leader called Neravas, an admirer of the Carthaginians and of Hamilcar in particular. The young chieftain switched sides, bringing 2,000 elite cavalrymen to Barca's side. In exchange for his help, the general offered his daughter in marriage to the Numidian. With the deal sealed, Hamilcar lured Spendius, the Gauls, and the Libyans into a battle of which there are scant details. We only know that the Carthaginian elephants and the Numidian allies did most of the job, massacring 10,000 of their enemies and capturing 4,000. Meanwhile, another force of mercenaries in Sardinia had decided to take up arms against their Carthaginian masters. Executing generals Bostrus and Hanno, the island fell briefly under rebel control, until the local population rose up against them and expelled them. Back in North Africa, Hamilcar suffered another unexpected reversal of fortune when the cities of Utica and Hippos Zarytus, which he had just liberated, suddenly pledged allegiance to the rebel cause. With the noose around Carthage tightened once again, all Hamilcar could do was resume his signature guerrilla tactics, harassing the supply lines of Spendius and Mathos with daring cavalry raids. In 238 BC, the scales of fortune tipped once again in Carthage's favor. Rome agreed to release thousands of prisoners from the Punic War, who promptly joined the ranks of Hamilcar. With his forces reinforced, the general was able to scale up his actions. Once again, Polybius does not offer much detail, except that Hamilcar was able to lure enemy contingents onto open, flat terrain, in which he had the advantage thanks to the elephants and the Numidian cavalry. This way Hamilcar defeated and detailed the superior enemy forces, to the point that they did not dare leave their main encampment. Barca then proceeded to besiege the camp, until the starved rebels were forced to acts of cannibalism. Eventually, Spendius, Autoratus, and 8 other rebel officers accepted an invitation from Hamilcar to parley. The sly general promptly took them hostage, betting that the leaderless rebel would soon commit a foolish act. And they did. The mutinied mercenaries sallied out of their camp in a disorderly fashion, seeking to retrieve their leaders. The Carthaginians then swooped in, surrounded them, and massacred 40,000 of their enemies. The last center of rebel resistance was Tunis, which Hamilcar surrounded with 2 armies. He personally led the southern contingent, while the northern siege lines were under the command of one General Hannibal. No, still not that Hannibal. Hannibal tried to shock the enemy by taking the now captive Spendius and other prisoners within sight of the besiegers, and then had them tortured, crucified, and slain. Mathos, observing from behind the walls, ordered a sortie which successfully destroyed Hannibal's camp. The defeated general was captured and crucified on the same cross that had held Spinaeus. Once Mathos had enacted his revenge, Hamilcar broke his camp and decided to relocate next to the mouth of the river Bagradas. At this stage, the Carthaginian Senate took inspiration from their Roman counterpart and decided to stage a final effort of willpower to bring the conflict to a close. 30 senators and General Hanno rallied as many citizens as they could into a new militia and joined forces with Hamilcar. After yet another campaign of low-intensity skirmishes, Hamilcar and Mathos agreed to settle scores in a pitched battle. The details are not known, except that it was a complete defeat for the rebels. Most of the Libyan mercenaries perished in the field, while the rest, including Mathos, were taken prisoner. With the swift recapture of Utica and Hippos Zarytus, the mercenary war was over, thanks primarily to the skill and genius of Hamilcar Barca, but the Carthaginian economy had been utterly drained by the decades of war, first against Rome, then against the rebels, and the Punic coffers were about to suffer another hit. Shortly before being expelled from Sardinia, the rebel mercenaries summoned Rome for help, and the Republic did intervene. Too late to help the rebels, but not too late to occupy the island. This caused outrage in Carthage, and its leaders demanded that the Romans evacuate Sardinia. Rome's response was to threaten another war, lest Carthage paid yet another tribute of 1,200 talents. The browbeaten Carthaginians could do nothing but comply. A faction within the Carthaginian Senate was inclined to blame Hamilcar for all their recent woes, especially the mercenary war. The undefeated general, however, enjoyed great popularity, and his own faction gradually acquired power on the political stage. Hamilcar was now free to set his own long-term plan, prepare Carthage for a future war against Rome, which he saw as inevitable. To achieve that, he had to secure the repayment of war indemnities to the Romans to prevent them from interfering in Carthaginian affairs, and to pay back the Republic. Hamilcar needed large deposits of silver and gold, which could be found in the Iberian Peninsula. Thus, in 238 BC, Hamilcar traveled to Spain in preparation for a long and successful campaign of conquest. Before embarking on the adventure, he performed ritual sacrifices to Baal and invited his 9-year-old son to participate. As the boy expressed his desire to join in the Spanish expedition, Hamilcar asked him to lay his right hand on the altar and swear that he would never be friends with Rome. The boy's name was, of course, Hannibal Barca, and the keeping of his oath would bring the Roman Republic to the brink of destruction. All episodes of our series on the Second Punic War are now available for our members.